Preface of Custer Battlefield, A History and Guide to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Custer Battlefield, A History and Guide to the Battle of the Little Bighorn by Robert M. Utley. Preface. About this book. And author's biography. The long, tragic history of Indian warfare in the American West reached its climax with the defeat of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry in Montana's Valley of the Little Bighorn River on June 25, 1876. Although the Indians won the battle, they subsequently lost the war against the white man's efforts to end their independent way of life. The story of the battle and its consequences is told in the following pages by Robert M. Utley in a compelling narrative of an event that has excited the imagination and provoked controversy ever since it happened. About the author. Robert M. Utley is a former chief historian and assistant director of the National Park Service. He began his career in the service at Custer Battlefield National Monument, where he served as historian from 1947 to 1952. He is the author of numerous books and articles on military and Indian topics, including a 2-volume history of the U.S. Army and the Indian, Frontiersmen in Blue, and Frontier Regulars. His most recent book is The Indian Frontier of the American West, 1846 to 1890. Now retired from the National Park Service, he devotes full time to writing history. End of preface and author's biography. Part 1 of Custer Battlefield by Robert M. Utley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1, An American Legend. On a scorching June Sunday in 1876, hundreds of Indian warriors converged on a grassy ridge rising above the valley of Montana's Little Bighorn River. On the ridge, 5 companies of United States cavalry, about 225 officers and troopers, fought desperately but hopelessly against many times their number. When the guns fell silent and the smoke and dust of battle lifted, no soldier survived. This was Custer's last battle, a spectacular triumph for the American Indian in his 4th-century struggle to hold back the white people who finally overpowered him. It is an episode that has burned brightly in popular memory for generation after generation. Printing presses have poured forth a steady stream of books, pamphlets, and magazines and newspaper articles about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Poets have found it irresistible. Painters and illustrators have turned out graphic representations ranging from giant canvases in oil to crude drawings on gum wrappers and bottle caps. Generations of children and their parents have sat in front of motion picture and television screens watching Indian warriors once again overwhelm the little band of cavalrymen and deal the mortal blow to Yellow Hair. Today, there are even national organizations devoted solely to the study of Custer and his last stand. The Custer battle has also served as a bellwether of changing popular attitudes. In the first half of the 20th century, Custer was paraded through the literature and across the movie screens as a conquering hero, symbol of the noble forces that opened the West to civilization and achieved America's continental destiny. In this scenario, the Indians served as mere impersonal foils to be swept aside to make room for the industrious pioneers who followed behind the soldiers. Later, in the Vietnam years, Custer became a different kind of symbol. For more than a decade, he personified all that was evil and brutal in America's historic treatment of the Indians and stood as a constant reminder of a deeply troubling guilt complex of the American people. Custer died for your sins, proclaimed bumper stickers and the title of a best-selling plea for Indian rights. Custer and the Little Bighorn also became a metaphor for Vietnam. In the movie Little Big Man, a lunatic Custer staggered about the battlefield roaring with mad laughter, underscoring the parallel that many people already perceived between Vietnam and the Indian Wars. The Little Bighorn lives on in our imagination, in part because of Custer himself. For 13 years he presented a hero-worshipping public with an irresistible combination: dashing, flamboyant, youthful war hero, and major general at 25. Controversial explorer, hunter, plainsman, sportsman, author, and publicist of the West. Indian fighter, crusader against political corruption, personification of the U.S. cavalry, and ideal husband. Yet he was also an enigma, a man of bewildering contradictions, both despised and loved, ridiculed and idolized. All this, and dead on the Little Bighorn at 36. The Little Bighorn lives on because people have found cavalrymen and Indians compelling subjects. The man on horseback has always ridden in the vanguard of our folk heroes, and in our image of the West, the blue-clad trooper and painted warrior have never been far behind the cowboy. And when these stereotypes are particularized, it is usually to Custer and his 7th Cavalry and the Sioux Indians of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The battle endures because the disaster to Custer's command, like the annihilation of the Texans at the Alamo, left no white survivor to tell the story. The rescue column found the unclad, mutilated bodies of the troopers scattered over the battlefield among the carcasses of their horses. The details of the fighting could only be guessed. The groundwork for endless speculation and debate had been laid. For more than a century, the full truth of what happened has eluded the assiduous quest of countless students. They have studied the documents and the battlefield itself, interviewed soldiers and Indians who were there, and pondered and argued over people and events. Today, much is known about what happened and why, but many questions remain unanswered, and into the void has fallen such an accumulation of myth and legend that an entranced public has little hope of distinguishing truth from fiction. Newsmen, army officers, Indians, popular writers, historians, dramatists, poets, artists, TV and movie producers, all have contributed mightily to the legend of the Little Bighorn. For more than a century they have amassed a truly extraordinary body of literature and graphics. Still the presses roll and the cameras turn, the public buys, the controversy rages, and there is no consensus of what happened or why on that bleak Montana ridge in America's centennial summer. End of Part 1. Part 2, Custer's Last Battle, of Custer Battlefield by Robert M. Utley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2A, Road to Little Bighorn, Recipe for Disaster. Road to the Little Bighorn. The Indians who wiped out Custer were Teton Sioux and Northern Cheyennes. 7 separate tribes made up the Teton Sioux: Hunkpapa, Blackfoot, Oglala, Brule, Two Kettle, Sanzark, and Miniconjou. Once they had lived around the headwaters of the Mississippi River, but pressed by Chippewas armed with muskets obtained from white traders, they retreated in the late 18th century westward to the Missouri River and beyond. In turn, they pushed aside weaker tribes and finally overspread the plains cut by the valleys of the Yellowstone River and its major tributaries, the Powder, Tongue, and Bighorn. The Cheyennes followed a similar course, but migrated to the southwest and made their homes along the Upper Platte River. Here they gradually split into 2 divisions. The Southern Cheyennes generally lived on the high plains between the Platte and Arkansas rivers. The Northern Cheyennes drifted northward to the country the Sioux now claimed. This land, so bounteous in buffalo and other resources that supported the Plains Indians' way of life, belonged to the Crow tribe. The Sioux swept aside the Crows, thus touching off generations of conflict between the 2 peoples. In this warfare, the Northern Cheyennes allied themselves with the Sioux. Then another tide rolled westward, this one of white people. Like the Crows before them, the Tetons were confronted with a powerful threat to their territory and freedom. They felt the first tremors in the early 1860s, when gold discoveries in the mountains of Idaho and western Montana set off a rush to the new bonanzas. Gold seekers went up the Missouri River on steamboats or set out in wagon trains overland to the mountains. The Indians resisted. Soldiers marched against them. Brigadier General Alfred Sully led an army of 2,000 to the Yellowstone in 1864, and Major General Patrick E. Connor threw 3 strong columns into the Powder River country in 1865. Sully won a victory at Killdeer Mountain, but Connor's army almost disintegrated when his supply system broke down. Recipe for Disaster. The end of the Civil War in 1865 gave new momentum to the westward movement of white Americans. Workmen pushed the rails of the Union Pacific up the Platte River Valley to meet and join in 1869 with the Central Pacific beyond the Rocky Mountains. The Northern Pacific built from St. Paul, Minnesota, aiming for Dakota Territory, and ultimately the Pacific Northwest. Steamers continued to ply the Missouri, carrying passengers and freight to Fort Benton, the head of navigation, for the land journey to the gold mines. Along the railroad and steamboat routes, the little post-war regular army built forts and stationed troops to guard travelers and settlers. For the Tetons and their Northern Cheyenne allies, the most serious menace loomed in the South. Beginning in 1866, immigrants increasingly looked to the Bozeman Trail as the best route to the Montana mines. Angling northwestward from the North Platte River, this route crossed the Powder, Tongue, and Bighorn rivers, struck the Yellowstone on its upper reaches, and continued to Virginia City and other mining camps. Piercing the Sioux buffalo ranges as it did, the trail infuriated the Indians, especially when soldiers came to protect it. 3 guardian forts, Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith, planted the army in the midst of the Sioux country. The tribes fought back, cutting off travel on the trail and bottling up the troops in their rude forts. The Sioux had many fine leaders that year of 1866, but increasingly they gave allegiance to one who was not even a chief, Red Cloud. Skilled in war and politics, Red Cloud mobilized the Teton tribes against the hated forts. A mystical young warrior named Crazy Horse also rose to prominence. He played a critical role in the conflict by leading a decoy party that enticed 81 soldiers and civilians out of Fort Phil Kearny squarely into an ambush. All perished. The annihilation of Captain William J. Fetterman and his command on December 21, 1866, stunned the nation and prompted demands for vengeance. Even so, Red Cloud won the war. Despite setbacks at the Wagon Box and Hayfield fights in August 1867, the Indians effectively disrupted travel on the Bozeman Trail. The government decided that the forts would have to be abandoned. For the Army, it was a humiliating retreat. But for the gold seekers, it made little difference. The rapid construction of the Union Pacific Railroad made the Montana mines more accessible by other routes. The government formalized its surrender in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Maddeningly, Red Cloud refused to sign until the soldiers had actually pulled out of the forts, after which his warriors promptly rode in and laid them waste. Even then, the Oglala leader tarried to hunt buffalo before finally journeying down to Fort Laramie, almost 6 months after he had been expected, to make his mark on the treaty. The Treaty of 1868 laid the groundwork for endless trouble between the Indians and the United States government. The government's aim was to get the Sioux together where they could be watched and controlled. That meant setting aside a reservation and feeding them. The treaty, therefore, established all of present South Dakota, west of the Missouri River, as the Great Sioux Reservation. In this sweep of plains, the Sioux would live while drawing rations and other provisions at agencies along the Missouri River. But the Sioux had won the war, and not all wished to become agency Indians. Besides giving up the Bozeman Trail, therefore, the government agreed to an unceded territory, free of whites, stretching from the western boundary of the reservation to the summit of the Bighorn Mountains. Here, in the Powder River Basin, long the heart of the Sioux domain, the Indians could continue to follow the buffalo. Most of the Tetons, some 15,000, succumbed to the lure of free rations and went to the reservation. Even Red Cloud, after exasperating government officials with shifting demands, finally gave in. But neither he nor his equally powerful rival, Spotted Tail, chief of the Brules, wanted an agency on the Missouri. The Indian Bureau at last agreed to locations far up the White River across the reservation boundary in Nebraska, and established Red Cloud and Spotted Tail agencies. Other agencies, chief among them Cheyenne River and Grand River, renamed Standing Rock in 1875, rose from the banks of the Missouri River to the east. Not all the Indians settled on the Great Sioux Reservation. A hardcore of holdouts, from 3,000 Sioux and 400 Cheyennes, stubbornly resisted all overtures from the government. They wanted nothing to do with white people or agencies or rations. They preferred the old life of the chase, and so long as the buffalo ran in the unceded territory, they remained free to do so as they pleased. The Indians in the unceded territory followed their own tribal chiefs and noted warriors. The Hunkpapas, for example, boasted Black Moon, Four Horns, Gall, Crow King, and Rain in the Face. The Miniconjous, Lame Deer and Hump. The Sans Arc, Black Eagle and Spotted Eagle. The Blackfoot Sioux, Jumping Bear, later known as John Grass. And the Oglalas, the incomparable Crazy Horse. Since his success in luring Captain Fetterman into the fatal trap set by his people in 1866, Crazy Horse, still the silent enigma of his early years, had emerged as the most powerful of the non-treaty Oglalas. The Northern Cheyennes, too, closely allied to the Sioux, counted dynamic leaders among their own roving bands: Dull Knife, Little Wolf, Two Moons, Dirty Moccasins, and Lame White Man. Above all the tribal leaders, however, towered a single chief of commanding influence, Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapas. In early battles, especially the fighting against General Sully in 1864-65, he had made an outstanding record. Since then, he had broadened his influence into spiritual and political realms. Rock-like dedication to traditional Indian values and unwavering opposition to all relations with the white people ran deep in his makeup and fortified his dominance. On his tribesmen at the agencies he heaped scorn. "You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of fat bacon, some hardtack, and a little sugar and coffee." All the Teton and Cheyenne roamers, while honoring immediate tribal allegiances, looked beyond them to the forceful personality, superior intellect, and personal magnetism of Sitting Bull. In the eyes of Indians and whites alike, the Powder River bands came more and more to be identified as Sitting Bull's people. These roving bands were a source of vast annoyance to the U.S. government, for they offered haven to the discontented agency Indians. In fact, many Sioux and Cheyennes shuttled back and forth between the Powder River country and the reservation, enjoying the best of both worlds, the free old life of the chase in the summer and the security and rations of the agency in the winter. On the reservation, these people created endless turmoil, for they were unmanageable, a menace to agency officials, and a disruptive influence on their brethren who remained there year-round. Off the reservation to the west, they did not always stay within the unceded territory. Sometimes war parties raided along the Platte and among the Montana settlements. Government authorities looked forward to the time when the unceded territory could be done away with. None believed more ardently in the necessity of this move than the Army's two senior officers, General William Tecumseh Sherman and Lieutenant General Philip H. Sheridan. Sherman commanded the U.S. Army, and with seamed face, grizzled red beard, and caustic manner, radiated absolute authority. Sheridan, headquartered in Chicago, presided over the vast military division of the Missouri, which embraced the Great Plains from Mexico to Canada. A short, stocky, combative Irishman, he too ruled with iron hand. With Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman and Sheridan made up the trio of generals whom the nation credited with victory over the Confederacy in the Civil War. Now Grant was President of the United States, and his two lieutenants ran the Army. Sherman, who had helped to negotiate the Treaty of 1868, never thought of the unceded territory as sacrosanct. "I suppose we must concede the Sioux the right to hunt from the Black Hills to the Bighorn Mountains," he wrote to Sheridan in 1870, "but the ultimate title is regarded as surrendered." In fact, Sherman and other treaty commissioners had expected the problem to solve itself. As the buffalo disappeared, the Indians would be left with no choice except to go to the reservation. But this did not happen at once, and white pressure on the Sioux hunting grounds intensified faster than the buffalo diminished. The first direct pressure came from the Northern Pacific Railway, which reached the Missouri River in 1873 and pointed its line toward the Yellowstone Valley. As he had with the Union Pacific, Sherman looked to this railroad as the Army's strongest ally. "That Northern Pacific road is going to give you a great deal of trouble," he warned Sheridan in 1872. "But the Army ought to give every possible assistance," he urged, "as it will help to bring the Indian problem to its final solution." Military escorts accompanied railroad surveying parties into the Yellowstone country during the summers of 1871, 1872, and 1873. Although the Treaty of 1868 permitted railroads, Sitting Bull's warriors, in several armed clashes with the Bluecoats, made clear their attitude toward this intrusion into their country. Leading the cavalry component of the Northern Pacific Expedition of 1873 was a bold young officer, already a national celebrity, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. In life, as later in death, this dashing cavalier provoked controversy. From associates he commanded either love or hate, rarely indifference. Some saw him as reckless, brutal, egotistical, selfish, unprincipled, and immature. Others looked upon him as upright, sincere, compassionate, honorable, tender, and above all fearless in battle and brilliant in leading men to victory. A mediocre student at West Point, Custer had been commissioned a second lieutenant early in the Civil War. Within 2 years, at the age of 23, he donned the star of a brigadier general. From Gettysburg to Appomattox, the gold-bedecked boy general, with long yellow hair and scarlet cravat, led first the Michigan Cavalry Brigade and then the 3rd Cavalry Division from one triumph to another. War's end found him at age 25, a major general and a national hero. In 1865, after the great volunteer armies of the Union went home, the little post-war regular army could no longer support all the generals who had conquered the Confederacy. Custer emerged from the war both as a major general of volunteers and a major general by brevet, an honorary distinction, in the regulars, but his line grade had advanced only to captain. With the reorganization of the regular army in 1866, however, he won appointment as lieutenant colonel of the newly formed 7th Cavalry Regiment. Ever since, while the regiment's colonel remained on detached service, Custer had led the 7th in campaigns against the Plains Indians. Custer's most celebrated victory came during the war with the Southern Cheyennes of Kansas and the Indian Territory. On November 27, 1868, he launched a dawn attack on the sleeping camp of Chief Black Kettle on the Washita River. The troops inflicted a crushing defeat on this group, but had to withdraw hastily when warriors from other villages appeared on the scene. The Battle of the Washita set off a lasting controversy. Humanitarians accused Custer of slaughtering peaceable Indians. Actually, the chief was peaceable, but his young warriors had just returned from a raid on Kansas settlements. Within the Army and within his own regiment, Custer was both criticized and defended for pulling out and leaving behind a small part of his force later found to have been wiped out. Custer and the 7th Cavalry came to the Northern Plains in time to participate in the Yellowstone Expedition of 1873. That autumn, the regiment took station at Fort Abraham Lincoln, a fine new post on the west bank of the Missouri River, across and downstream from the railhead town of Bismarck. Many wives joined their husbands, including Elizabeth Custer, a vivacious, beautiful woman, utterly devoted to her mate. She set the tone for a garrison life that was gay and briskly social. Custer had got his first taste of the Northern Indians in skirmishes with Sitting Bull's warriors on the Yellowstone. Now he would figure conspicuously in the next chapter of the gathering conflict with the Sioux. Sidebar: Centennial Summer. In 1876, the United States celebrated the centennial. President Ulysses S. Grant launched a 7-month birthday party on May 10 in Philadelphia, where a century earlier delegates from the colonies had cut the ties from Great Britain. In Fairmount Park, in some 200 gaudy buildings, multitudes of visitors marveled at exhibits that recorded 100 years of industrial and cultural progress. The displays reflected the nation's mood. Dominated by the huge Corliss steam engine, the array of machines and other examples of industrial might captured the exuberant self-congratulation that animated Americans at the onset of the Gilded Age. They also exhibited a bizarre taste that produced such wonders as a Liberty Bell fashioned from tobacco plugs, and a likeness of George Washington made from the hair of Venezuelan patriot Simón Bolivar. On July 3rd, Generals William T. Sherman and Philip H. Sheridan joined thousands of other celebrants for festivities opening the nation's 100th birthday. At midnight, fireworks burst over flag-draped Independence Hall to illumine throngs of patriotic revelers. Later, the generals toured the exposition. On July 6th, along with all of Philadelphia, they opened the morning newspapers to read garbled accounts of a military disaster on the western frontier. Questioned by reporters, both generals ridiculed the news as a wild fantasy. At this moment, an aide handed Sherman a telegram. It confirmed the newspaper reports. Custer was dead. Sidebar: Red Cloud. When he signed the Fort Laramie Treaty in November 1868, this powerful Oglala Sioux chief became the only Indian leader to win a war with the United States. He promised to try to keep his people out of future conflicts with the whites, but he had no control over younger warriors like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall, who resisted the U.S. government's civilizing program under the provisions of the Laramie Treaty. Sidebar: Lieutenant General Philip H. Sheridan, commanding the Division of the Missouri, admired Custer's valor and dash, but never entirely trusted his judgment. Neither did Sheridan's boss, General of the Army William T. Sherman, who thought Custer very brave, even to rashness, and advised General Terry to keep him on a tight rein during the 1876 Sioux campaign. After learning of Custer's fate, Sheridan told Sherman that he considered the whole affair an unnecessary sacrifice. End of sidebars. End of section 2A. Part 2 of Custer's Last Battle of Custer Battlefield by Robert M. Utley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2B, Campaign of 1876. It was not the Yellowstone, but the Black Hills that ignited the volatile mixture of Indian and white. The Black Hills were not part of the unceded territory, but of the Great Sioux Reservation itself. With rumors of gold floating about the settlements of Dakota, the territory's promoters, anxious to learn what the hazy Blue Mountains to the west might hide, agitated for an official exploration of the Black Hills. General Sheridan also wanted to know more about this area, for he had decided that he needed a fort somewhere near there to keep watch over the Sioux. Early in 1874, he won authority to send a military expedition to look for a suitable location. To command it, he turned to his young protege at Fort Lincoln. For the troopers of Custer's 7th Cavalry, the Black Hills expedition of 1874 turned out to be a summer's lark among forested, game-rich slopes drained by rushing creeks full of trout. On the northeastern edge of the hills, Custer found an ideal site for Sheridan's military post. Fort Meade would be established there in 1878. But of vaster, greater consequence in the streams of the hills themselves, he found confirmation of the rumors of gold. A courier bearing official dispatches took the word out. "Gold in the Black Hills," shouted the newspaper headlines. Even before the year's end, gold seekers had rushed to the Black Hills, and the spring of 1875 saw the stampede under way in earnest. Custer City, Deadwood, and other mining camps sprang up in the most promising valleys. Vainly the Army tried to turn back the prospectors. Vainly, too, the government tried to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux. Although some of the agency chiefs gave signs of weakening, the turbulent young warriors who spent part of the year with Sitting Bull would have none of it. Any chief who signed risked his life at the hands of these men. The Indians' attitude irritated government officials. Rationalizing that the Sioux had broken the treaty by raiding around the edges of the unceded territory, they laid plans to end the troublesome roaming of the non-treaty bands and to press the agency chiefs to sell the Black Hills. President Grant himself quietly approved a new policy. Soldiers would no longer bar settlers from the unceded territory west of the reservation boundary, and if some go over the boundary into the Black Hills, General Sherman understood, the President and the Interior Department would wink at it for the present. These so-called settlers, of course, were interested in the Black Hills, not the land to the west. The new policy meant simply that prospectors could now enter the Black Hills without military interference. Shortly afterward, in December 1875, the government moved against the non-treaties. Native runners bore an ultimatum from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to the Sioux and Cheyennes in the unceded territory. Report at the agencies by January 31, 1876, or be branded hostile and driven in by the Army. In their snowbound teepees, the hunting bands received the ultimatum with disdain. The deadline was impossibly close at hand, and moving camp in midwinter, especially such long distances, was exhausting and perilous. Such considerations, however, mattered little to the roamers because they had no intention of giving up their country or way of life for the reservation. Besides, they did not seriously believe that the Army would make war on them. They ignored the summons. The deadline came without response. On February 1, 1876, the Secretary of the Interior, whose department included the Indian Bureau, certified all Indians in the unceded territory as hostile, and asked the Secretary of War to take such measures as he thought appropriate. General Sheridan welcomed this development. He had urged a winter campaign that would catch the Indians off guard and had fretted over the delay caused by the Indian Bureau's insistence on first giving them a chance to come in. At once, Sheridan ordered his subordinate commanders to organize strong expeditions for an invasion of the Indian stronghold. These officers were Brigadier General George Crook, commanding the Department of the Platte from Omaha, and Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, commanding the Department of Dakota from St. Paul. Crook, a reticent, unpretentious man who rarely shared his thoughts or plans with even his closest aides, had come to his present command the year before after defeating the Apaches of Arizona. With a thick blond beard, forked and sometimes braided, a canvas suit, and durable mule, he projected an image of homespun simplicity. Terry, tall, bearded, and a man of marked kindliness and humility, had practiced law before the Civil War, but had done so well as a wartime general of volunteers that he had been rewarded with a brigadier's commission in the regular service. Sheridan drew up a plan that called for a strategy of convergence. 3 columns, 1 from Crook's department and 2 from Terry's, would converge from 3 directions on the locale thought to be occupied by the Indians. No particular concert of action would be attempted, for each column would be strong enough to defeat any expected combination of Indians. The Indian Bureau assured the Army that no more than 500 to 800 fighting men ranged the entire unceded territory, and they, of course, were scattered in their winter camps. This estimate, in fact, was close to accurate. Between 400 and 500 lodges, sheltering a population of some 3,000 people, made up Sitting Bull's following. For the generals, the uncertainty lay not in the present, but in the future strength of their opponents, in how many agency Indians would head west this year, and how soon. Thus Sheridan's anxiety to take the field before spring, when the yearly influx from the agencies would begin to reinforce the roamers. But estimates of Indian strength figured critically in military calculations only in hindsight, after disaster demanded an explanation. No matter how many Indians gathered, the planners assumed, they could not remain together in large numbers for more than a few days. Their ponies quickly stripped the surrounding grass and fouled the water sources, their hunters decimated and frightened away nearby game, and their campfires consumed available fuel. As General Sheridan told a congressional committee in 1874, even though the Sioux might field 3,000 or 4,000 fighting men, "we cannot have any war with Indians because they cannot maintain 500 men together for 3 days. They cannot feed them." The fact is that no officer of the three columns doubted the ability of the troops to whip any number of Indians they could find. The great worry, rather, was that the troops would not be able to find them, or bring them to decisive battle if they did. Such was the lesson, with rare exceptions, of the Army's experience in Indian warfare. Only one of Sheridan's 3 striking arms got under way before winter ended. General Crook, the Gray Fox, organized a force of 800 infantry and cavalry at Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, on the North Platte River. Early in March, he pushed northward on the old Bozeman Trail through deep snow and sub-zero cold. Scouts spotted an Indian camp on Powder River, and Crook sent Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds and 6 companies of cavalry to attack it. On the bitterly cold morning of March 17, the troopers stormed into the village. The surprised Indians scattered, but rallied and counterattacked. Timidly, Reynolds abandoned his prize and fell back to the main column. Angry and discouraged, Crook turned about and headed for Fort Fetterman to outfit for another try. He did not march again until May 29, 2 months later. Meantime, General Terry's preparations had been slowed by winter storms. Early in April, however, his Montana column shoved off from Fort Ellis in western Montana and marched eastward down the Yellowstone River. Commanded by Colonel John Gibbon, it consisted of about 450 men of the 2nd Cavalry and 7th Infantry, with 25 Crow Indians, the bitter enemies of the Sioux, serving as scouts. On May 17, Terry's other force, the Dakota Column, finally marched out of Fort Lincoln and pointed west toward the Yellowstone. Sheridan's winter campaign had become a summer campaign. Terry himself commanded the Dakota Column. He had meant Custer to command, but during the spring Custer had been summoned to Washington as a witness in congressional hearings on frontier fraud. His testimony so angered President Grant that he ordered Terry to launch the expedition without Custer. Sheridan and Terry both asked the President to relent, and he finally allowed Custer to go along, but only at the head of his own regiment and only under Terry's command. The Dakota Column included all 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry. Numbering about 600 officers and troopers, the regiment stood at little more than half its authorized strength. In addition, there were 2 companies of the 17th Infantry and 1 of the 6th to guard a train of 150 supply wagons, a detachment of the 20th Infantry serving 3 rapid-fire Gatling guns, and about 35 Arikara Indian scouts. Altogether, the Dakota Column numbered about 925 officers and enlisted men. It was the 7th Cavalry, however, that Terry expected would run down the Indians and bring them to battle. Despite the President's displeasure, Terry believed the tireless and tenacious Custer just the officer to do it. As customary, the Indians Crook and Terry sought had passed the winter widely dispersed in small camps among the valleys of the Powder River country and even as far east as the Black Hills. By March 1876, they had drifted to the Powder itself and its eastern tributaries. The village on Powder River that Colonel Reynolds attacked on March 17 consisted of about 100 lodges of Oglalas, Miniconjous, and Cheyennes. After the soldiers withdrew, the warriors reclaimed their village and moved downstream, then over to the east fork of the Little Powder to unite with Crazy Horse. The fight on Powder River served unmistakable notice that the soldiers meant war. The combined bands now set forth to find Sitting Bull, who was camped about 60 miles farther north on another branch of Powder River. Little by little, as word of the war sped from one camp to another, the Indians came together for self-defense. As the spring grass greened, they moved slowly westward from the Powder to the Tongue, and on to the Rosebud, their numbers swelling as one group after another joined. By early June they had reached a strength of about 400 lodges, about 3,000 people, including some 800 warriors. While camped on the lower Tongue River early in May, the Indians discovered soldiers on the north bank of the Yellowstone, opposite the mouth of the Bighorn, and sent in a raiding party of about 50 men, which ran off the horses of the Crow scouts. Later in the month, after the troops had moved farther down the Yellowstone, warriors harassed scouting and hunting parties from the military camp. After a buffalo hunt, the Indians moved up Rosebud Creek. Early in June, they paused for a sun dance, the annual ceremony of tribal renewal and spiritual rededication. It was a deeply moving experience, made the more intense by the external menace and the common commitment to stand together in meeting it. In a prophetic vision, Sitting Bull saw many dead soldiers falling right into our camp. It was an immensely thrilling and promising image. The spring grass not only fattened the ponies of these Indians, but also set in motion the annual spring movement of their kinsmen from the agencies. From Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Red Cloud, and Spotted Tail agencies, parties headed for the Powder River country. Besides the usual lure of a summer's hunt, this year they went in anger over the white people's attempt to seize the Black Hills and the government's ultimatum to abandon the unceded territory. And this year, because of these resentments, they went in larger numbers than ever. They moved slowly, waiting for the grass to ripen and their ponies to gain strength. As Crook and Terry prepared to march, Colonel Gibbon tarried on the Yellowstone, his mission to prevent Indians from crossing the river and escaping to the north. Through late April and early May, he bivouacked on the north bank of the river, opposite the mouth of the Bighorn, then moved downstream to new camps near the mouth of the Rosebud. Rain and mud limited his movements, but his Crow scouts under the efficient Lieutenant James H. Bradley kept watch on the valleys to the south. Abundant signs gave notice of Sioux nearby, and the humiliating theft of the Crow scouts' ponies on May 3rd erased any lingering doubt. On May 16, Bradley and a reconnoitering party spotted the main Sioux and Cheyenne camp in the Tongue River Valley, and Gibbon tried without success to get his command across the Bankful River to march against it. Again, on May 27, the scouts located the quarry, this time in Rosebud Valley, only 18 miles from Gibbon's position. To the east, meantime, Terry and Custer searched for these same Indians. Curiously, in dispatches to Terry, Gibbon failed to inform his superior that he knew exactly the location of the big village that all three columns sought. Acting on reports that Sitting Bull himself waited on the Little Missouri to give battle, Terry sent Custer to scout this stream for signs of Sioux. Not until June 8, when he reached the Yellowstone at the mouth of the Powder and met officers from the Montana column, did Terry learn where the Indians were. Wrongly assuming the village would still be on the lower Rosebud, where Bradley had seen it 2 weeks earlier, Terry laid plans to trap it between Custer and Gibbon. First, however, he wanted to assure himself that the Indians had not doubled back to the east. He therefore sent 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry under Major Marcus A. Reno on a southward swing to examine the Powder and Tongue valleys, and rejoin the main command at the mouth of the Tongue. He then prepared to push on to meet the Montana column. At the mouth of the Powder, Terry established a supply depot manned by his own infantry and dismounted cavalry, and another 3 infantry companies that had come upriver from Fort Buford. Here, too, he met Captain Grant Marsh with the river steamer Far West, chartered by the government to transport supplies and speed communication. Leaving all his wagons at the depot and organizing a mule pack train to carry provisions, Terry had Custer march the balance of his regiment up the Yellowstone to the mouth of the Tongue. Terry himself steamed up on the Far West. Major Reno violated his instructions. Finding no fresh indications of Indians in either the Powder or Tongue valleys, he decided to cross to the Rosebud. Here he promptly discovered recent campsites. Since Bradley's sighting of May 27, Sitting Bull and his people had not, as Terry supposed, remained in place, but had moved on up to the Rosebud to the southwest. Reno followed far enough to ensure that they had indeed left the area, then turned back to the Yellowstone to report to Terry. Unknown to Reno, as he countermarched on June 17, momentous events were taking place only 40 miles up this very valley. On May 29, General Crook had again marched forth on the old Bozeman Trail, leading more than 1,000 men drawn from the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry and the 4th and 9th Infantry. Near the head of the Tongue River, he paused for a week, awaiting the arrival of Crow and Shoshone allies he had invited to help him fight the Sioux. When they finally appeared, 262 strong, the expedition moved. On the morning of June 17, Crook's column halted for coffee on Upper Rosebud Creek. Suddenly, hundreds of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors burst upon them. Crook's Indian allies rushed to the attack and held back the assailants until the troops could organize for battle. For 6 hours, the two sides fought valiantly among the rolling hills shouldering the Rosebud. In mid-afternoon, the Indians broke off the battle and withdrew, leaving Crook bloodied but in possession of the field. Burdened by the wounded, the Gray Fox decided that he had no choice but to fall back to the base camp he had left only the day before. Also, the experience had left him badly shaken and determined not to risk another advance without a stronger command. From his Goose Creek bivouac, near modern-day Sheridan, Wyoming, he called for reinforcements. Crook thus counted himself out of the events, shaping up only a short distance to the north. The intelligence that Major Reno brought back from the Rosebud forced Terry to revise his plan of action. Actually, he changed the plan itself very little, merely shifting its place of execution farther west. On the morning of June 21, Terry penned a dispatch to General Sheridan, telling of his new plan. Gibbon, he said, would march back up the Yellowstone, cross the river on the far west, and then work his way up the Bighorn to the mouth of the Little Bighorn. At the same time, Custer would lead the 7th Cavalry up the Rosebud, cross to the upper Little Bighorn, and descend that stream toward Gibbon. "I only hope that one of the two columns will find the Indians," he concluded. "I go personally with Gibbon." Terry's plan reflected both what he knew and what he did not know about his opponents. As for their strength, the campsites that Reno examined in the Rosebud Valley revealed about 400 lodges, the same as Bradley's estimate a month earlier. At 2 men per lodge, this made about 800 fighters. The whereabouts of the agency Indians, and whether any had joined the main camp since it had left the lower Rosebud, he did not know, nor does he seem to have worried much about it. The Indians' location was also a mystery. Terry knew that about 2 weeks earlier they were ascending the Rosebud. They could have continued up that river, or swung eastward toward the Black Hills, or they could have crossed to the Little Bighorn, or turned north down Tullock's Creek toward the Yellowstone. The general impression was that they would be found on the upper Little Bighorn. Lower down they would be approaching the Bighorn, beyond which lay Crow country and the risk of a collision with their longtime enemies. Because of the Indians' uncertain location, Terry's plan, above all, had to be flexible. Although not explicitly stated, everyone expected Custer, with his aggressive drive and more mobile column, to make the kill. Gibbon's role was mainly to block the northward flight of any Indians who got away from Custer's cavalry. Custer's mission, therefore, was to march up the Rosebud on the Indian Trail. If it turned to the Little Bighorn, he was still to continue up the Rosebud before swinging west to the upper reaches of the Little Bighorn, this to make certain the Indians did not get away to the south or east, and to give Gibbon's infantry time to get into blocking position at the mouth of the Little Bighorn. Terry expected him there by June 26, but this date had no other significance. The 7th Cavalry carried rations for 15 days, and Custer left no doubt that he would use them all, if necessary, to find the Indians. The notion that Terry meant for him to attack on June 26 arose only after the offensive ended in disaster. That afternoon, June 21, Terry summoned his principal subordinates to a conference in the cabin of the Far West, moored to the bank of the Yellowstone at the mouth of the Rosebud. Bent over a map spread out on a table, Terry, Gibbon, Custer, and Major James Brisbane, Gibbon's cavalry chief, worked out the details and timing of Terry's strategy. In their talk they assumed, as usual, that the Indians would scatter and run if given the chance. General Crook could have told them differently, but word of the Battle of the Rosebud had not yet reached the Yellowstone. Thus everyone worried, not about how to defeat the Indians, but how to catch them before they discovered the soldiers and fled in all directions. As Gibbon said, the object of the plan was to prevent the escape of the Indians, which was the idea pervading the minds of all of us. The next morning, as the 7th Cavalry prepared to march, Terry handed Custer written orders that his adjutant general had put to paper during the night. In the never-ending, never-conclusive attempt to fix the blame for what happened afterward, every word and every nuance of those orders would be fiercely debated. At noon on June 22, the 7th Cavalry passed in review before Terry, Gibbon, and Custer astride their mounts. The regimental band, Custer's pride, had been left at the Powder River base, but masked trumpets provided a measure of panoply. Company by company they trooped in front of their commanders, each raising its own cloud of dust, each marked by a swallowtail guidon in the pattern of an American flag. As usual in the field, the lean, bronzed troopers displayed every variety of costume. Slouch hats, gray or blue shirts, and the regulation sky blue trousers stuffed into cavalry boots predominated. To ease saddle wear, many had lined their trouser seats with canvas. Each man carried a Springfield single-shot carbine and a Colt revolver, with 100 cartridges for the former and 24 for the latter. Sabers had been left behind, they were cumbersome, and soldiers rarely got close enough to Indians to use them anyway. Custer's command numbered 31 officers and 566 enlisted men, 35 Indian scouts, the Arikaras, 4 Sioux, and 6 Crows, borrowed from Gibbon, and about a dozen packers, guides, and other civilian employees. Bringing up the rear, a train of pack mules bore rations and forage for 15 days, together with reserve carbine ammunition of 50 rounds per man. The train had already begun to give trouble, some of the mules breaking formation and throwing their packs. Despite his embarrassment over the train, Custer swelled with pride at the spectacle. He wore his customary field gear, fringed buckskin jacket and trousers, knee-high troop boots and scarlet cravat and broad-shouldered blue shirt of Civil War memory, and a wide-brimmed white hat. 2 holsters encased a pair of snub-nosed English revolvers. Close-cropped hair belied his Indian name, Longhair, and with ragged beard and fierce sunburn, he hardly resembled the immaculate officer depicted by the artists of the Eastern journals. A mounted orderly bore his personal pennant, displaying white-crossed sabers against a red and blue field. The regiment's formidable appearance concealed serious internal conflicts. Some of the officers accorded Custer blind loyalty and adulation. Notable among them were Captain Thomas B. Weir, Lieutenant William W. Cook, the Canadian-born regimental adjutant, and, of course, his own relatives, brother Captain Thomas W. Custer, brother-in-law Lieutenant James Calhoun, and 2 civilians, brother Boston, hired as a forage master, and nephew Armstrong Reed, embarked on a summer's outing with his namesake uncle. Other officers looked on Custer with contempt or even loathing. Among these were his 2 senior subordinates, Major Marcus A. Reno and Captain Frederick W. Benteen. Reno, dark and swarthy, had done well as a colonel in the Civil War, but no longer commanded much respect from his brother officers. Benteen, captain of Company H, had been a wartime lieutenant colonel. Lean, muscular, clean-shaven, and white-haired, fearless in battle, he was widely admired as the ideal company commander. He returned the compliment with ill-tempered ridicule of all but a few brother officers. For Custer he harbored a passionate hatred that soured his character for the rest of his life. Amid clouds of choking dust, Custer's troopers pushed up the Rosebud. They covered 12 miles that afternoon, but racked up 30 each on the next 2 days. On the second day, June 23, they struck the Indian trail that Major Reno had already examined, and by the morning of the 24th they had reached the limit of Reno's reconnaissance. Here they paused at the site where the Sioux had staged their sun dance earlier in the month. The Indian scouts saw enough evidence of powerful medicine to make them restive. Shortly after leaving the Sundance campsite, the column confronted another development. The Indian trail, hitherto by all indications several weeks old, suddenly turned fresh. Signs estimated to be no more than 2 days old suggested that the quarry could not be very far away, perhaps as near as 20 miles. The scouts probably knew the explanation, but no one consulted them, and the officers speculated at length. Custer sent the Crows forward to gather more information. Across the Rosebud Divide to the west, circumstances conspired to give the Sioux and Cheyennes crucial advantages in the coming conflict. Ignorant as yet of Custer's approach, they had no plans to meet the danger he presented. Extraordinary good fortune, however, came to their support. As Sitting Bull's following made its way slowly up the Rosebud through early June, a scattering of people arrived from the agencies. At the same time, however, others departed on hunting forays to scout the enemy's movements, and even to trade for arms and ammunition at distant points on the Missouri River. The size of the village, therefore, remained about 400 teepees. The scouting parties kept watch on General Crook as well as Colonel Gibbon. On June 9, one even tried to run off Crook's cavalry horses, but failed. On June 16, another group saw Crook break camp and head down the Rosebud. Hurrying back to warn of the danger, they found that the village had crossed from the Rosebud to a tributary of the Little Bighorn, later named Reno Creek. The next day, most of the young men, perhaps 500 to 700, rode back to the Rosebud and upstream to head off the soldiers, whose further advance would soon imperil the village. In fierce fighting, they succeeded in their aim, for next day Crook's men countermarched to their base at Goose Creek. The chiefs decided to move the village again. On June 18, the people struck camp, journeyed down Reno Creek to the Little Bighorn, then turned south up the valley and pitched their teepees. Here, a short distance above the mouth of Reno Creek, they remained for 6 days. Here they staged a festive celebration of the victory over the soldiers on the Rosebud, and here they gained another cause for celebration, for at last their brethren from the agencies began to arrive. On the back trail from the Rosebud down to Reno Creek and down the Little Bighorn itself, they came suddenly and in great numbers. During these 6 days, Sitting Bull's village more than doubled from 400 to nearly 1,000 lodges, from 3,000 to nearly 7,000 people, from 800 to nearly 2,000 warriors. In 6 separate tribal circles, they crowded the narrow valley. Hunkpapas, Oglalas, Miniconjous, Sans Arcs, Blackfoot, Two Kettles, Brûlés, and a gathering of Yanktonais and Santees, Sioux but not Tetons, made up the 5 Sioux circles, while 120 Cheyenne lodges rounded out the great array. Even a handful of Arapahoes cast their lot with their friends. The tribal leaders had planned a movement farther up the Little Bighorn to the upper portion of the valley, exactly where General Terry expected to find them. Scouts, however, brought word of antelope herds to the north and west downstream. On June 24, therefore, they moved the village northward, back down the Little Bighorn in the direction from which they had come. The new location afforded an appealing setting. The upper end of the camp, anchored by the Hunkpapa Circle, lay about 2 miles below the mouth of Reno Creek. The rest of the teepees sprawled along the west bank of the river for nearly 3 miles downstream. On the west, the level valley, ranging from 1/2 mile to a full mile in width, ended in low, grassy hills and benches where the huge pony herd grazed. On the eastern edge of the valley, the river, cold and bank full with the spring runoff from the Bighorn Mountains, meandered among thickets of shady cottonwood trees. A series of ragged bluffs rose steeply from the east bank of the river to a height of some 300 feet. On the south, the bluffs fell away to Reno Creek, on the north to a dry watercourse, later called Medicine Tail Coulee, which opened on the river across from the Miniconjou and Sans Arc circles. North of Medicine Tail, the breaks rose in tumbled furrows to a long, narrow ridge paralleling the valley opposite the lower end of the village, where the Oglalas and Northern Cheyennes camped. From here one could scan the entire village, and beyond to the snow-mantled Bighorn Mountains, low on the southwestern horizon. Here, on the banks of the pretty stream the Sioux called the Greasy Grass, stretched a village of unusual size. Such numbers consumed immense quantities of game, forage, and firewood, and so could not remain long in one place, or even together in one village. It had come together in this strength only in the few days preceding, and it could stay together for more than a few days or a week only through luck, frequent moves, and constant labor. White apologists, seeking to explain the disaster this coalition of tribes wrought, would later endow it with an immensity it never approached. Still, it was big by all standards of the time, and it was more than twice as big as any of the army officers looking for it anticipated. Furthermore, and of still greater portent, the village contained a people basking proudly in the fullness of tribal power. Contrary to the planning assumptions and the mindset of army officers, the Indians had little inclination to avoid conflict. Their grievances united them in a determination to fight against those who would seize the Black Hills, and send soldiers to force them out of the unceded territory guaranteed by the Treaty of 1868. Sitting Bull's sun dance prophecy, and their victory at the Rosebud, hardened their resolve. And all these measures of strength aside, they would, as always, fight tenaciously if the enemy threatened their women and children. Such was the objective that George Armstrong Custer sought as the sun rose on that Sunday, June 25, 1876. Sidebar: Elizabeth Bacon Custer was 34 when this photograph was taken in 1876. She was devoted to her husband and had followed him from one frontier station to another. Their last post was Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, which served as their home and Custer's base of operations from 1873 until 1876. It was from here, on May 17, 1876, that he set out on the campaign that ended in defeat and death on the Little Bighorn. Mrs. Custer survived her husband by 57 years, and spent every one of them guarding and perpetuating his memory. She died in 1933 at the age of 91. Lieutenant Colonel and Mrs. Custer in the study of their home at Fort Lincoln about 1873. The large portrait on the wall at left shows Custer in his Civil War garb. The one on the right is General Philip Sheridan. Sidebar: The Black Hills Expedition of 1874. In contrast to treeless plains on all sides, the Black Hills held a special place in the affections of the Sioux. They treasured the hills as their meat pack, rich in game, with sheltered valleys and abundant firewood, ideal for winter camping. Drawn by these resources, the Sioux had seized the Black Hills from the Kiowas a century earlier, and had jealously guarded them against whites and other Indians ever since. In the Treaty of 1868, the government had included the Black Hills in the Great Sioux Reservation. Whites coveted the Black Hills. Remote, mysterious, imperfectly known, the region inspired persistent rumors of gold that periodically set off mining boomlets in frontier towns. Settlers denounced the Treaty of 1868 and demanded that the government investigate the reports of gold. Officially, the Custer expedition of 1874 sought a suitable location for a military post to keep watch on the Sioux. The presence of two "practical miners" with the expedition suggested another purpose as well. Their discovery of gold, "from the grassroots down," set off a rush of prospectors. The Sioux reacted in fury. "Thieves' Road" they branded Custer's trail to the Black Hills, and they angrily turned aside government efforts to buy the mineral region. The Thieves' Road led not only to the Black Hills, but ultimately to the Little Bighorn. If Custer dug his own grave in the Black Hills, as some suggested, his death on the Little Bighorn doomed Sioux hopes of keeping the hills. In the atmosphere of national outrage stirred by Custer's last stand, the government forced the Sioux to sell the Black Hills. 38 members of Custer's Officer and Scientific Corps posed for a group portrait at the camp on Box Elder Creek, Dakota Territory, August 13, 1874. About half of the men shown here took part in the Battle of the Little Bighorn almost 2 years later. Sidebar: Indian Leaders. The Sioux and Cheyennes had a number of outstanding leaders. Their authority over others, however, was much more apparent than real. In battle, the Indian fought as an individual, not bound to any particular group, and free to come and go as he chose. Indians did not have commanders and sub-commanders, as the U.S. Army did. Each tribe had various warrior societies, each with its chief and sub-chiefs. Some of them were great warriors, but in battle they could not give an order and expect to have it obeyed. Any influence the chiefs had was based on personal prowess, and they risked losing this prestige every time they failed in an undertaking. Some of the more prominent Indian leaders who took part in the Battle of the Little Bighorn are shown on the following pages. 1. Sitting Bull, Hunkpapa Sioux. 2. Crow King, Hunkpapa Sioux. 3. Jumping Bear, Blackfoot Sioux. 4. Rain in the Face, Hunkpapa Sioux. 5. Red Horse, Minikunju Sioux. 6. Spotted Eagle, Sanzark Sioux. 7. Low Dog, Oglala Sioux. 8. Two Moon, Northern Cheyenne. Sidebar: The Sioux War of 1876. In the spring and early summer of 1876, General Philip H. Sheridan sent 3 Army columns totaling 2,500 men into southeastern Montana Territory. Their mission: to break up a concentration of Sioux and Cheyenne Indians deemed hostile by the U.S. government and drive them onto reservations. One column, led by General George Crook, was attacked and forced to turn back at the Battle of the Rosebud. The other 2, under Colonel John Gibbon and General Alfred H. Terry, joined on the Yellowstone at the mouth of the Rosebud. From here, Terry, the expedition's commander, laid plans to locate the Indians, then believed to be in the Little Bighorn Valley. Taking Gibbon's column on up the Yellowstone to approach the valley from the north, Terry sent Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer and the 7th Cavalry on a wide sweep to the south to approach it from the opposite direction. If all went well, the Indians would be caught between the two forces. The movements of the various troop columns are shown on the map, along with many of the places that figured prominently in the events leading to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Sidebar: Brigadier General George Crook, who commanded the Department of the Platte in 1876, had already helped to end Indian wars in southern Oregon, Idaho, northern California, and Arizona. He understood the Indian way of life probably better than any other Army officer, and blamed most of the troubles on tardy and broken faith on the part of the general government. His defeat at the Battle of the Rosebud on June 17, 1876, knocked his troops completely out of the campaign and may have contributed to Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn. Sidebar: Colonel John Gibbon commanded the Montana column out of Fort Ellis. A battle-scarred veteran of 34 years of military service, he was supposed to prevent the escape of the Indians that Custer's cavalry column would drive toward him. But he feared that Custer would find the Indians before his infantry was in position to block their northward flight. Gibbon's soldiers were the first to arrive at the Little Bighorn battlefield to rescue the survivors of Custer's command on June 27. Sidebar. Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, Custer's commander, had headed the Department of Dakota since 1873. Though he had never led a field operation against Indians until the 1876 Sioux campaign, he was an able and well-liked officer. His ambiguously phrased June 22 orders to Custer laid the basis for endless controversy over whether they had been obeyed or disobeyed. Terry refused all public comment on the subject, but privately he wrote Sheridan that, quote, "Our plan must have been successful had it been carried out." End quote. Sidebar. Terry's orders to Custer. Camp at mouth of Rosebud River, Montana Territory, June 22, 1876. Colonel: The Brigadier General commanding directs that as soon as your regiment can be made ready for the march, you will proceed up the Rosebud in pursuit of the Indians whose trail was discovered by Major Reno a few days since. It is, of course, impossible to give you any definite instructions in regard to this movement, and were it not impossible to do so, the department commander places too much confidence in your zeal, energy, and ability to wish to impose upon you precise orders which might hamper your action when nearly in contact with the enemy. He will, however, indicate to you his own views of what your action should be, and he desires that you should conform to them unless you shall see sufficient reason for departing from them. He thinks that you should proceed up the Rosebud until you ascertain definitely the direction in which the trail above spoken of leads. Should it be found, as it appears almost certain that it will be found, to turn towards the Little Horn, he thinks that you should still proceed southward, perhaps as far as the headwaters of the Tongue, and then turn toward the Little Horn, feeling constantly, however, to your left, so as to preclude the escape of the Indians to the south or southeast by passing around your left flank. The column of Colonel Gibbon is now in motion for the mouth of the Big Horn. As soon as it reaches that point it will cross the Yellowstone and move up at least as far as the forks of the Big and Little Horns. Of course, its future movements must be controlled by circumstances as they arise, but it is hoped that the Indians, if upon the Little Horn, may be so nearly enclosed by the two columns that their escape will be impossible. The department commander desires that on your way up the Rosebud you should thoroughly examine the upper part of Tullock's Creek, and that you should endeavor to send a scout through to Colonel Gibbon's column with the information of the result of your examination. The lower part of this creek will be examined by a detachment from Colonel Gibbon's command. The supply steamer will be pushed up the Big Horn as far as the forks of the river is found to be navigable for that distance, and the department commander, who will accompany the column of Colonel Gibbon, desires you to report to him there not later than the expiration of the time for which your troops are rationed, unless in the meantime you receive further orders. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, E. W. Smith, Captain, 18th Infantry, Acting Assistant Adjutant General. Sidebar. The Sioux Warrior. For Sioux males, war was both sport and ceremony, part of the very fabric of tribal life. It was a way to acquire property, especially horses, and to win glory and respect by performing brave deeds in combat. The Sioux went to war to capture horses from their enemies and to protect and defend their hunting grounds. There were two types of forays: horse raids, in which the object was to steal into an enemy village and make off with its horses, and war parties, which were usually mounted for revenge or tribal defense. Horse raids might number from a few warriors to 15 or 20. War parties were usually larger, perhaps as many as 100 warriors, plus a few boys for menial chores and a few women for cooking. Before the advent of the white man on the plains in the 1830s, fighting between tribes was usually small and sporadic. A warrior won honor in combat by counting coup. A coup was an act of daring: striking an enemy, victory in hand-to-hand combat, saving a friend in battle, stealing a horse. It entitled a warrior to wear an eagle feather on the back of his head and distinctive marks on his clothing. Enough coup, and a warrior had a war bonnet, which he wore in battle to show his ability. A warrior usually went on the war path, if not into battle, with an impressive amount of gear: a bow and arrow, a knife, a shield, sometimes a lance, and a parfleche in which he carried extra moccasins, war paint, ceremonial items, a pipe and tobacco, war clothing, including a bonnet and coup feathers if he had them, and jerky and pemmican. Warriors at the Little Bighorn also carried rifles. Sidebar: The Cavalryman. The mounted trooper, unlike his adversary, fought for no great national or personal cause. He was a volunteer, often a recent immigrant, who did his job for his pay, about $13 a month, and the honor of his uniform. The Army taught him how to ride, how to use his weapons, how to fight, mounted or dismounted, with his troops or battalion, and it probably gave him whatever basic education he had. It took the Army decades to learn how to fight the Indians on their own terms. The Plains warrior was a master of guerrilla warfare, skillful, highly motivated, and mobile. The Army was accustomed to fighting in conventional ways, which placed a premium on superior numbers and firepower. Eventually, during the 1870s and 1880s, the Army went over to mobile tactics, and by the use of better intelligence, converging columns, and winter campaigning, it succeeded in breaking the last resistance of the Indians. The cavalry was the main instrument of this warfare. When employed with infantry, it was a formidable opponent. This illustration shows a veteran cavalryman of 1876. He is dressed in the uniform that became generally available after 1873: a blue wool blouse, sky blue trousers, gray shirt, boots, and a wide-brimmed civilian hat in place of the Army hat, which was poorly made and quickly lost its shape. He is armed with a .45 caliber Springfield carbine, a single-shot breech-loader, and a .45 Colt revolver, both models 1873. He was authorized a saber, but usually left it behind on campaign because he rarely got close enough to the enemy to use it. Items in inset illustration: carbine and carbine sling, saber, .45 Colt revolver and cartridge belt, shelter half, knife and sheath, overcoat, picket pin and lariat, sideline, feedback, canteen, haversack, tin cup, saddlebags, poncho, forage sack. Sidebar: Custer's principal subordinates were Major Marcus A. Reno and Captain Frederick W. Benteen. While neither officer cared much for the other, they were linked first by their mutual dislike of Custer, and then by the necessity of defending their conduct in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Both men considered Custer highly overrated as a military leader, and laid the blame for the defeat squarely on his shoulders. Sidebar: Lieutenant William W. Cook, 30-year-old Canadian soldier of fortune, was the 7th Cavalry's adjutant. He was a strong Custer supporter and one of the ablest and most efficient members of the regiment. He scribbled the last message from Custer on a page torn from his memorandum book, and died beside his chief an hour later on what is now known as Custer Hill. Sidebar: Custer family casualties. The Custer family lost 5 of its members in the Battle of the Little Bighorn: the 3 brothers, George, Thomas, and Boston, their nephew, Harry Reed, and their brother-in-law, James Calhoun, who was married to their sister Margaret. Tom Custer, a 2-time Medal of Honor winner, commanded Company C and died beside his older brother. Boston Custer, a civilian guide, and Harry Reed, who had come along expecting to see the 7th Cavalry win another quick victory, were killed nearby, and Lieutenant Calhoun, commanding Company L, perished with his troops on the hill that now bears his name. End of sidebars. End of section 2B. Part 2 of Custer's Last Battle of Custer Battlefield by Robert M. Utley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2C, Battle of the Little Bighorn. Reno attacks. Custer destroyed. The 7th Cavalry's noon meal stop on June 24 stretched into 4 hours as the new and troubling Indian sign preoccupied everyone. Scouts rode out in advance to gather more information. The trail was now fresh, noted the expedition's itinerarist, and the whole valley scratched out by the trailing lodge poles. Probably worried that the sign meant that the village was breaking up and scattering, Custer apparently did not guess the true explanation. The old trail had suddenly become overlaid and confused by the recent trails left by numerous groups of agency Indians converging to unite with Sitting Bull. At dusk the regiment camped for the night. At 9, after darkness had fallen, the Crows returned with new intelligence. Just ahead, they told Custer, the Indian trail veered to the west and climbed the divide between the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn. They had followed it to the summit, but facing the setting sun, had not been able to see anything beyond. Custer did some hasty calculations and at once adjusted his plans. Now he knew that the Indians could not be on the Rosebud, nor could they have doubled back to the Yellowstone. Neither could they be on the upper Little Bighorn, for the trail up the divide was too fresh to have allowed time to get that far. Thus they had to be on the lower Little Bighorn. Swiftly Custer made a crucial decision. Calling his officers together over a flickering candle, he outlined a new plan. Instead of continuing up the Rosebud, he would follow the trail across the divide under cover of night, spend the next day resting the command and fixing the location of the Indian camp, then hit it with a dawn attack on June 26, the date appointed for Gibbon to reach the mouth of the Little Bighorn. Rousted from bivouac about midnight, the troopers groped blindly forward in the darkness, marching another 6 miles up the rough, rocky valley of a small stream now named Davis Creek. At 2 a.m., still short of the summit, the weary horsemen halted. As day dawned, they made coffee, although the alkaline water made it all but undrinkable. Riding about the command bareback, Custer paused at the cook fire of the Arikaris. Bloody Knife, half Sioux and half Arikara, was talking. Custer asked the interpreter what he said. "He says we'll find enough Sioux to keep us fighting 2 or 3 days." Custer smiled. "I guess we'll get through with them in 1 day," he observed. Earlier, while the regiment marched in dusty blackness, Lieutenant Charles A. Varnum and several of the scouts under his command had climbed a high hill to the west, part of the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn, known as the Crow's Nest. At dawn, they scanned the wrinkled landscape rolling off to the Bighorn Mountains. Some 15 miles to the west, where a thread of green traced the course of the Little Bighorn, the Crows spotted smoke rising from the Sioux and Cheyenne village, and on the bench land beyond they picked out an undulating dark smudge that represented the pony herd. Varnum could not see the village, nor could Custer when he climbed the peak in response to the lieutenant's summons, but he had no reason to doubt that the Crows had seen it. They placed it just where the direction and freshness of the trail indicated it should be. Almost at once, however, word came that stirred new alarm. 2 parties of Sioux were spotted in the vicinity of the breakfasting soldiers. All experience pointed to the certainty that these Indians would hasten to warn the village of the soldiers' approach. Then the gnawing fear that had ridden with the regiment all the way from Fort Lincoln would be realized. The village would break up and flee in all directions. And so Custer made a second crucial decision, to find the village and strike it as soon as possible. For his decisions on the evening of June 24 and the morning of June 25, Custer has been both condemned and defended. His detractors, pointing to his burning pride in the 7th Cavalry and his reputation as an impetuous commander, have charged him with willfully disobeying orders in a heedless race to win all the glory. He disregarded Terry's suggestion that he continue up the Rosebud beyond the point where the Indian trail left it, then rushed a command, exhausted by a night march, into battle without first learning the exact location and strength of the enemy. Defenders point to the language in Terry's instructions, leaving all movements to Custer's discretion. The Indian trail plainly disclosed that the Sioux and Cheyennes were so near that they could not possibly have slipped off to the southeast. To continue up the Rosebud would have required him to lose touch with an enemy he now had in his immediate front, to make a long detour through country he knew could not harbor many Indians, and to risk the very possibility that everyone so pervasively feared, the escape of the Indians. Once the regiment had been discovered, moreover, there could be no other proper decision than to attack, for the Indians could hardly have been expected to remain in place waiting until the soldiers found it convenient to fight. Reno attacks. Shortly after noon on June 25, 1876, the 7th Cavalry topped the divide and halted at the head of Reno Creek. Custer had his adjutant, Lieutenant Cook, form the regiment into battalions. Major Reno took command of one, consisting of companies A, G, and M, 140 officers and enlisted men. Captain Benteen headed the second, consisting of companies D, H, and K, about 125 strong. Custer himself retained 5 companies, about 225 horsemen, under his immediate command, but subdivided them into 2 battalions. Captain George Yates led the first, consisting of companies E and F, and Captain Miles W. Keogh the second, composed of companies C, I, and L. Yates, a Custer loyalist, captained Company F, called the Bandbox Troop, for its smart appearance. Keogh, captain of Company I, was an Irish soldier of fortune and veteran of the Papal Guards, who had come to America in 1862 to fight for the Union. Captain Thomas N. McDougall was assigned with B Company to guard the pack train and bring up the rear. Custer shared Terry's concern about the Indians slipping away to the southeast. What the scouts had seen from the crow's nest at dawn suggested that the village lay downstream from where he would strike the river, but prudence dictated that he make certain no Indians were upstream, where they would be behind him. From the head of Reno Creek, Custer could not see southeast into the Little Bighorn Valley. A line of ridges blocked the view. Immediately after dividing the regiment, therefore, he ordered Benteen to lead his battalion to these ridges and look for Indians before rejoining the trail of the main column. Subsequently, as Custer learned that more than one line of ridges intervened, he sent word for Benteen to move on to successive crests until he could see the Little Bighorn Valley. As Benteen wheeled to the left, the rest of the column trotted down the narrow valley of Reno Creek. The 2 commands rode parallel, Custer's on the right bank of the creek, Reno's on the left. Lieutenant Varnum and the Indian scouts ranged in advance. The pack train struggled along in the rear and quickly fell behind. A march of about 10 miles brought the horsemen by 2:15 p.m. to within 4 miles of the Little Bighorn. Here they rode through an abandoned Indian campsite. A lone tepee remained standing, containing the body of a slain warrior. The Indian scouts set it afire. From the village at this site the warriors had ridden forth on June 16 to do battle with Crook. Here the troops flushed a party of Sioux. Interpreter Fred Gerard rode to the top of a knoll beside the trail, waved his hat, and shouted, "Here are your Indians, General, running like devils." Ahead, some 40 warriors raced their ponies toward the river. To the right, or north, Custer saw a column of dust rising from beyond high bluffs that hid the valley from view. The dust doubtless meant to him that he had at last found the village and that its occupants had taken alarm and were trying to get away. Even though Benteen could not be called upon, the situation demanded an immediate attack. Instantly, Custer ordered Reno to pursue the fleeing warriors, and charge afterward, and you will be supported by the whole outfit. Reno's battalion, accompanied by Varnum and the scouts, took up a fast trot down Reno Creek as the Indians vanished in the distance. At the tree-shaded ford, the soldiers stopped to drink, throwing the formation into confusion. Reno finally got it reassembled on the other bank and led it onto the level valley floor. Downstream, in the distance, clouds of dust rose from the valley, and mounted Indians could be seen racing about. Gerard, the interpreter, concluded that the warriors were riding forth to give battle. Knowing that Custer supposed them to be fleeing, he turned back to relay the news. Soon he overtook Adjutant Cook and another officer who had accompanied Reno as far as the river. Explaining that the Indians were not running, but were coming out to fight, Gerard wheeled to rejoin Reno. Ironically, Custer had come close to surprising the Sioux and Cheyennes. They had only minutes of warning before the soldiers struck. Hunters were out looking for game. Except for a few ponies tethered in camp, the herd grazed on the bench to the west. Men lazed in their teepees. The soldiers, of course, also raised dust, and this first alerted the Indians. Warriors with ponies mounted, while others rushed toward the herd. The Hunkpapas and Blackfoot at the upper end of the camp made frantic preparations to meet Reno's advance, and thus created the dust and commotion that misled Gerard and others. With the three companies side by side in column of fours, Reno's battalion trotted down the valley. After a short distance, Reno changed the formation, placing Company G in reserve behind M and A, then later brought G back on line with the other two. Ahead, a timbered bend of the river jutted into the valley. From behind this tongue of green, dust continued to boil skyward. A few teepee tops could be indistinctly seen, and horsemen in growing numbers raced about in the dust. Anxiously, Reno looked back for the support Custer had promised, but could see none. Another half-mile, and the little handful of men would be swallowed by what looked like overpowering numbers of Indians, although probably no more than a couple of hundred had yet gathered. Reno threw up his hand and shouted for the command to fight on foot. The advance ground to a halt within sight of the Hunkpapa circle. Private James Turley's horse bolted and carried him forward into the dust. "That was the last I saw of him," said his sergeant. Every fourth man grabbed the reins of his own and three other horses, and led them to the rear, then into the timber. A thin skirmish line stretched part way across the valley, carbines popping at blurred images in the dust. Mounted Sioux raced the length of the line, curled around the exposed left flank, and appeared in the rear. Within 15 minutes, Reno decided that the position had to be abandoned. His men filed to the right into the cottonwood groves that anchored the right flank. Here an old river bank afforded a natural breastwork, but here also dense timber and heavy undergrowth thwarted all attempts at a coherent formation. Reno quickly lost control of his companies. Warriors worked through the brush and trees and gathered on the other side of the river to fire from the rear. Within half an hour, closely pressed, the major decided that this position could not be held either. He mounted and shouted for his men to mount. Scout Bloody Knife sat his horse next to Reno. A bullet sang through the trees and smashed into his skull, splattering Reno's face with blood and brains. Disconcerted, Reno ordered the men to dismount, then recovered and again shouted to mount. Confusion spread as some men obeyed and others misunderstood, and still others failed to see or hear their commander. On the edge of the timber, the cavalrymen mounted in a loose column formation. Reno took the lead and signaled a withdrawal back up the valley. Sioux kneed their ponies in from the right. "When we came out of the woods," recalled Lieutenant Varnum, "there were a great many Indians scampering along with their rifles across the saddle, working their Winchesters on the column." This deadly fire deflected the retreat toward the river and the high bluffs beyond. No rear guard held back the Sioux, and soon they mixed with the galloping troopers, now seized by panic. "The Indians picked off the troops at will," commented Gerard. "It was a rout, not a charge." At the river no force covered the crossing, and warriors gathered on the banks to fire at the soldiers struggling in the water. Those who reached the east side made their way up the ravines that cut into the ramparts of bluffs. Exhausted and beaten, the remnant of the battalion gathered atop the bluffs. Of 140 men who had charged down the valley scarcely an hour earlier, 40 had been killed and 13 wounded. Among the dead were Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, cut down in the retreat; Lieutenant Benjamin H. Hodgson, knocked into the river, then fatally hit while being dragged up the bank, grasping the stirrup of a passing rider; Dr. James M. DeWolf, dropped by a shot from the top of the bluffs while scaling an exposed hogback separating two ravines; civilian interpreter Isaiah Dorman, the only black man with the expedition, killed in the valley; and the noted scout, Lonesome Charlie Reynolds, also killed in the flight from the valley. Lieutenant Charles C. DeRudio and 16 men were missing. They had not heard the order to retreat and had been left behind in the timber. No sooner had the broken command reached the new refuge than the Indians began to pull back. It was a stroke of timely good fortune for both the men on the bluffs and those in the timber below. But it was ill fortune for Custer, whose whereabouts Reno's men speculated upon as the Indians vanished from their front. It was now late afternoon, shortly after 4 o'clock. Custer destroyed. Exactly how Custer and his men met their fate can never be fully and certainly known. None of the battalion survived to tell what happened. Indian participants gave confused and contradictory stories, at least to white ears. So, in fact, did Reno's men, especially as the enormity of the catastrophe and the search for blame began to warp their memories. These accounts, however, together with the placement of the bodies on the battlefield, provided a foundation for sketching the broad outlines of the action. More recent battlefield evidence, some obtained through archaeological projects, has permitted further informed analysis. From these diverse sources the following sequence is deduced. After Major Reno set off to charge the Indians in the valley, Custer and his battalion continued down Reno Creek to its junction with the North Fork. While watering their horses there, Adjutant Cook brought word, as relayed by Gerard, that the Indians were not running, but coming out to meet Reno. If Custer had intended to follow Reno into battle, he now changed his mind, for he turned north, away from Reno Creek, and toward the dust that continued to rise from behind the skyline to his right front. Why? Did he plan to fall on the Indians' rear as Reno engaged their front? Or was he still obsessed with the fear that they would escape and took this means to block their route? Or both? Or some other plan? Or no particular plan at all? Although Bloody Knife and other scouts had tried to warn him of many more Indians than expected, he still knew no more of their strength and location than indicated by the dust cloud. In parallel columns of twos, the 5 companies galloped up the long, gentle slope toward the bluff tops. After a mile or so, they stopped short of the brow. Custer, his orderly trumpeter for the day, and the Crow scouts rode to the top and looked out over the valley. It was Custer's first view of the objective. Just below, the river swung in a wide loop halfway across the valley. Down the valley, recalled one of the Crow scouts, were camps and camps and camps. There was a big camp in a circle near the West Hills. Below also, related another of the Crows, we could see Reno fighting. He had crossed the creek. Everything was a scramble with lots of Sioux. Back at the command, Custer conferred briefly with Adjutant Cook and other officers, including his daredevil younger brother, Tom, captain of Company C, and the proud bearer of 2 medals of honor for Civil War heroism. As the march resumed, Tom Custer rode to his company and, motioning to Sergeant Daniel Kanipe, told him to hurry back to Captain McDougall with orders from Custer. "Tell McDougall," he instructed, "to bring the pack train straight across to high ground. If packs get loose, don't stop to fix them, cut them off. Come quick, big Indian camp." As the sergeant turned aside, Custer resumed the march northward below the crest of the bluffs, toward Varnum, fighting with Reno in the valley, glimpsed the Gray Horse Company, E, passing along the skyline on the command's flank. Some of the horses became excited and broke into a gallop, out in front even of Custer. "Boys, hold your horses," Kanipe heard Custer shout. "There are plenty of them down there for us all." The command swung to the right, down a long north-trending ravine falling away from the heights. It was narrow and forced the formation into a column. After a half mile or more, the ravine opened into the broad coulee now known as Medicine Tail. Custer signaled a left turn into the coulee. Anxious to get Benteen into the fight and still worried about ammunition, Custer decided to send another courier. He motioned for his orderly trumpeter, an Italian immigrant who had recently anglicized his name from Giovanni Martini to John Martin, and barked instructions. Cook, no doubt distrusting Martin's mastery of English, scrawled a message on a page of his memorandum book, tore it out, and handed it to him. "Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. W. W. Cook, P. Bring packs." The final words showed with what haste Cook wrote. Spurring his horse up the back trail, Martin glanced over his shoulder. The last I saw of the command, they were going down into the ravine, Medicine Tail. The gray horse troop was in the center, and they were galloping. Later he heard firing, looked about, and saw Indians, some waving buffalo robes and some shooting. Farther up the trail, Martin met Boston Custer, hurrying from his post with the pack train to join his brothers in the battle. What happened next is reasonably well established by battlefield finds and Indian testimony. Why it happened can only be theorized. The 2-company battalion under Captain Yates descended the Medicine Trail Coulee to the Little Bighorn River, while the 3-company battalion of Captain Keogh ascended the north slope of Medicine Tail, just beyond the mouth of the ravine the column had followed from the heights. At the river, Yates ran into a hot fire from warriors posted in the brush on the other side. The bullets flew so thickly, recalled a Sioux participant, that the head of his command reeled back toward the bluffs after losing several men who tumbled into the water. The Crow scouts previously released by Custer watched from the steep hillside to the south as these soldiers splashed into the water. Sitting Bull later described this action succinctly. "Our young men rained lead across the river and drove the white braves back." At first, only a handful of warriors, perhaps 30, held the fort against Yates. But they quickly received help as men returned from the pony herd with their mounts, and others, freed by Reno's retreat, reached the new scene of action. The Hunkpapa Gall rallied the forces and led them in a rush across the river. Back from the river, Yates' companies withdrew, returning a ragged defensive fire as they rode, dismounting skirmishers to hold back the Indian advance. These soldiers held their horses' reins on one arm while they were shooting, remembered Low Dog, but the horses were so frightened that they pulled the men all around, and a great many of their shots went up in the air and did us no harm. The line of this fighting retreat lay up the northern slope of a branch of Medicine Tail, now known as Deep Coulee, and ended on a low, flat hill forming the southern nose of a high ridge since called Battle Ridge. The rush of Gall's warriors also hit Keogh's 3 companies, posted in strong positions on the ridges separating Medicine Tail and Deep Coulees. From dismounted skirmish lines, the troopers laid down a heavy fire, including some volley firing that kept the Indians at bay. After 30 to 45 minutes, they withdrew. Gall's warriors pressed closely. After crossing Deep Coulee, Keogh started up the south slope of Battle Ridge. Again, to relieve the threat to his rear, he dismounted and formed a line. Here, though, the Indians fired into the horse holders and succeeded in felling enough men and stampeding enough horses to put the command largely on foot. With the horses went reserve carbine ammunition. After this, related Gall, the soldiers threw aside their guns, carbines, and fought with little guns, pistols. Dismounted, Keogh's companies moved to the southern end of Battle Ridge, and at last linked up with Yates on the hill that later took the name of the L Company commander, Lieutenant James Calhoun. What Custer intended, or indeed whether he accompanied Yates or Keogh, is conjecture. Some students even believe that he fell, killed or wounded, with Yates at the river, and was carried to the hill where his body was later found. Yates may have been the leading element of a charge into the village, with Keogh prevented from following by Gall's powerful warrior force. Or Keogh may have been working his way northward to strike the village from still another direction. One of several plausible theories is that Custer, delaying a decisive thrust until Benteen arrived with the packs, sent Yates to hold the ford and himself remained with Keogh on the heights, commanding the route by which Benteen would come. Whatever the intent, the Indians proved too strong, and all 5 companies reunited on Calhoun Hill. Besides the Indians crossing the Little Bighorn at the Medicine Tail Ford, many crossed lower down the valley at the mouth of a deep ravine draining the western slope of Battle Ridge. From this cover they fired on Custer's flank on Calhoun Hill. To counter this threat, or perhaps even to find another ford by which to charge the village, Custer sent the troopers of Company C galloping down the side of the ridge to the head of the ravine. "The Indians hidden there got back quickly," said the Cheyenne woman, Kate Bighead. "The soldiers stopped and got off their horses along another ridge, a low one just north of the deep gulch. They doubtless meant to fire into the ravine, but Lame White Man, a Cheyenne, hit them with a sudden attack that overran the company and scattered the survivors back to Calhoun Hill. The final desperate stage of the fighting occurred along Battle Ridge. While Keogh held Calhoun Hill against the warriors crossing at the mouth of Medicine Tail, Yates' two companies, probably accompanied by Custer, moved northward on the ridge. Custer may have been looking for a better defensive position, or even, given his aggressive temperament, a way to get into the village. But the Indians converged in overpowering force from all directions. Fire from the east grew so hot that Yates' companies gathered for shelter on the western slope. In the fighting with Custer's battalion, the Indians made few, if any, grand mounted charges. Mostly they kept up a long-range fire from dismounted positions behind hillocks, sagebrush clumps, tall grass, and in the folds and troughs of the terrain. From these places of concealment they struck down the cavalrymen with bullets from rifles, carbines, and pistols, some taken from Reno's dead in the valley, and old trade muskets. Arrows also took a heavy toll. Loosed in high arcs, they fell with deadly effect on clusters of exposed troopers. The fatal blow fell from the north. As the fighting progressed from Medicine Tail Ford to Battle Ridge, Crazy Horse had led a large force of warriors down the Little Bighorn Valley to a crossing below the village, forded the river, and swept in a wide arc to climb Battle Ridge from the north. They struck the units with Custer and Yates and thrust up the ravine on the east leading to Calhoun Hill. Here they crushed Keogh's men against Gall's warriors beyond. Although each of the companies made its last stand, the last stand of history and legend occurred on the western slope of the northern end of Battle Ridge, now known as Custer Hill. Here Companies E and F and survivors of the other companies gathered around Custer's headquarters banner. Whether in panic or deliberate counterattack, a large contingent of soldiers broke toward the head of the deep ravine in the direction of the river. "We finished up this party right there in the ravine," said Red Horse. The rest, about 40, shot their horses for breastworks on the hillside and fought until all died. Among them were the three Custer brothers and nephew Ottie Reed, Captain Yates, Adjutant Cook, and Lieutenants Algernon E. Smith and William Van W. Riley. Keogh and Calhoun fell with their men to the south, and 3 officers were never found or never identified. The Sioux and Cheyennes, defending their homes and families, full of a sense of power and a conviction of injustice, did their work thoroughly. The soldiers fought back with a ferocity and bravery that earned high tribute from Sitting Bull himself. How long they fought before the last man fell is still debated, possibly 2 hours or more from Medicine Tail to Custer Hill. Sidebar: Varnum's Detachment of Scouts. Scouts, both white and Indian, played important roles in the Sioux campaign of 1876. White Scouts, like Charlie Reynolds, were civilians hired at a specified wage by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Department. Indian Scouts, on the other hand, were enlisted men who, though technically not soldiers, were considered to be officially part of the Army. But Indian Scouts, unlike white soldiers, signed on for indefinite periods and served at the discretion of the departmental commander. The detachment of Indian Scouts enlisted for the 1876 campaign were mostly Arikara, 2 of whom are shown on the opposite page under the command of Lieutenant Charles A. Varnum. A handful of Crow Scouts on detached service from the 7th Infantry accompanied the troops to the Little Bighorn and were nominally under Varnum's command. The 4 Crow Scouts shown opposite accompanied Custer's column on the day of the battle, but escaped death. Sidebar: Custer divides his command. Early on the morning of June 25, Custer viewed the distant Little Bighorn Valley from the Crow's Nest. Shortly past noon, on the divide between the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn watershed, he formed the 7th Cavalry into battalions for the advance on the Indians, whose exact location was still not known. Sidebar. The scout Bloody Knife was the son of a Sioux father and an Arikara mother. He had served at Fort Lincoln in various scouting capacities ever since the fort was established, and had taken part in a number of exploring expeditions, including Custer's 1874 Black Hills foray. Fearless and outspoken, he often ridiculed whites, including Custer himself. Bloody Knife's Sioux relatives despised him for fighting with the soldiers, and none of them mourned when he died in the valley during Reno's attack on June 25. Sidebar. The blue and gold regimental standard of the 7th Cavalry remained with the pack train during the battle. Each of the 12 companies that fought at the Little Bighorn carried a silk stars and stripes guidon like this one to mark its position on the battlefield. Sidebar. Mitch Weir, a half-blood interpreter for the regiment's Crow Scouts, had predicted that there was going to be a damned big fight. Both he and Bloody Knife warned Custer that the Little Bighorn Valley contained more Indians than the cavalry could handle. Boyer died with Custer. Sidebar. Fred Gerard, civilian interpreter for the Arikara Scouts, brought the first word to Custer that, contrary to expectations, the Indians were not running away but preparing to attack. Sidebar. Trumpeter John Martin, the last surviving trooper to see the Custer Battalion alive. He carried Custer's last message to Captain Benteen, written by Custer's adjutant, Lieutenant William W. Cook. Benteen's translation of Cook's hastily scrawled summons appears at the top. Below, Sergeant Daniel Knipe, who belonged to Captain Tom Custer's C Company, carried the first message from Custer to Captain McDougall, ordering up the pack train. Sidebar. How many Indians? Estimates of the Indian strength at the Little Bighorn fluctuate wildly to 30,000 and 40,000 people, with as many as 12,000 fighting men. The figures used in this publication are drawn from John S. Gray's Centennial Campaign. Gray performed an exhaustive analysis of population statistics and all other relevant evidence to reach numbers lower than usually given. Interestingly, his findings coincide with the very first estimates by white observers, who at once began revising their figures upwards. For example, as Gray notes, Captain Benteen's first guess on the morning of June 27 was 1,500 to 1,800 warriors, but by the evening of the same day it had grown to 2,500. By July 4 to 3,000, and by 1879 to 8,000 to 9,000. Gray's calculations, about 1,000 lodges, slightly more than 7,000 people, possibly as many as 2,000 warriors if the older boys participated in the fighting. Sidebar. Gall, Hunkpapa war leader, led the frontal attack against Custer's column, while Crazy Horse and Two Moon struck them flank and rear. His warriors had already routed Reno's men from the valley. Gall later claimed that at the time of the battle, the Sioux had no idea that they were fighting Custer. They thought they were fighting Crook. Sidebar. French-born Lieutenant Edward G. Matthey of Company M commanded the pack train and took part in Reno's hilltop fight on June 25 and 26. End of sidebars. End of section 2C.